Live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We are so excited to see all of you. This webinar is titled Trauma-Informed Practices and Construction of the Deep Reading Brain. Very interesting topic, and we've got a lot of great discussion in store for you guys today. Want to take a second to welcome folks that we saw. We really appreciate you guys dropping your names and your locations in the chat. Sarah from Sydney, Michael from Jersey, and a personal favorite of mine, Valerie from my hometown of Detroit. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to get started here. Before I do dive in, though, I want to take a minute to thank our hosts at EdWeek for inviting this very important topic, as well as our colleagues at the National Campaign for Grade Level Reading and their managing director, Ralph Smith, for providing a platform for us to share this important work. I'm sure one of the reasons that you registered for this webinar is because the topic is extremely timely. We're going to take some time on this meeting to talk about trauma-informed practices, because we need social, emotionally healthy children, and how we can build children's deep reading brains through relationships. So I'm going to take a second to allow our co-presenters to introduce themselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and thank you for this kind invitation. I'm Renee Boynton-Jarrett. I'm a primary care pediatrician and public health researcher at Boston Medical Center, and I direct the Vital Village Networks, which promotes community capacity to promote child well-being. Thank you for having me today.
Neena?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Neena McConnico, and I am the director of the Child Witness to Violence Project at Boston Medical Center, and I am also the director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the hospital in the Department of Pediatrics.
Thank you, Neena. Before I jump over to my colleague, Sondra, can you all just give us a little bit of background about your organizations?
Sure, I can go first. So the Child Witness to Violence Project, we are an outpatient mental health program where we provide therapeutic services to young children between the ages of birth and 8 years old who have experienced some kind of violence exposure and other kinds of relational trauma. And in addition to the therapeutic work that we do, we also provide a lot of trainings similar to these kinds of webinars to a variety of providers and organizations who are working with young children who've been impacted by trauma and violence exposure. And we also provide a lot of consultation as well.
Wonderful. Vital Village Networks is also based at Boston Medical Center. We've had the privilege of working closely with the Child Witness to Violence Project for many years as close collaborators. We work to help improve community capacity to promote optimal well-being and social emotional development for children by centering caregivers as lead designers of community-driven solutions. In that work, we promote trauma-sensitive classrooms. We promote social mobility pathways for community leadership, shared data, and cross-sector collaborations to achieve optimal outcomes that allow children to flourish.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee and Neena. Sondra?
I'm Sondra Mims. I'm the Chief Academic Officer here at the Atlanta Speech School. I've been here for a very long time. I've worked in our school for children who are dyslexic and now serve as the academic lead for all of our programs. We have 4 schools, 4 clinics, and the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. And we have all of these things under one roof. And under our roof, we are every child's conversational partner. We believe that we have created an ecosystem for our children that builds their self-esteem, their social emotional safety, And we do everything we can to make it possible for our children to learn in the very best way that they can.
Thank you, Sondra. So I am Ryan Lee James. I am the director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy at the Atlanta Speech School. We have had the privilege of collaborating with Renee and Neena very closely for the last 18 months, I would say. And so we're thrilled to be able to host this webinar in collaboration with Vital Village and Strive and all of the great work that is going on there at Boston Medical. The Rollins Center for Language and Literacy is a program of the Atlanta Speech School, and through our free online Cox campus, we offer video-based training and resources at no cost to the learner, on behalf of, or thankful, made possible by our generous donors. And so we're going to share a little bit more about Cox Campus as we move through this presentation. Importantly, Renee and Neena have decided to bring their work to the Cox Campus, which is extremely exciting for us. And we hope that you all will find it useful. So we're going to move through and we're going to be engaging. We're going to have some conversation here about some really important topics. Then we're going to switch over to Q&A. I do want to say, I know that we may not be, there was quite a few questions submitted ahead of time. So we're going to work to answer as many questions as we can, and then selecting some questions to be able to answer offline. So we'll try to provide a written response and then send them over to EdWeek to be uploaded in the resource tab. All right, so part of what we wanted to do with this webinar, as the four of us sort of sat down and prepared, part of what we wanted to do was to sort of create a paradigm shift in the way that we are currently talking about what has happened around COVID and the context. And one of the ways we thought we could do this is by starting with defining and talking about why a strengths-based perspective is really important now more than ever. And so we're going to kick off our conversation talking about this because, again, we really wanted to we want to sort of be a catalyst for changing the conversation around what our children are experiencing, especially our children from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds, and especially our children of color, as we so often use real deficit language to describe those groups. And so I'm going to kick it over to my colleagues, and then I'll jump in here and there. But I'll start, by asking and posing the question that you guys see on the slide. What is a strengths-based perspective, and why is it important now more than ever? How about, anyone jump in? I'm looking at you, Neena, because I know you're eager on this topic. So jump in, please.
Thank you, Ryan. I think I have had a lot of conversation and thought, and I've been doing this work for a while. And I think similarly to what you had said, that a lot of times when we have this conversation and we're thinking about adversities and we're thinking about, really challenging things that children and their families have experienced, that there is a lot of deficit language that kind of goes along with that. And I have been even thinking a lot about even the term trauma-informed practices and what that means. And I think that we kind of need to center ourselves around thinking about ways in which children and their families are resilient, and kind of what are they bringing to those relationships that they are finding themselves in? What are they bringing to those environments? What are they bringing to school? And to really kind of challenge ourselves to think about even what our definition of strength is, or what our definition of resilience looks like. Where is that rooted? I think I could say that a lot of kind of when we think about resilience and we think about developmental milestones, a lot of that is rooted in kind of more of a Western European ideology that doesn't necessarily take into account what we commonly call kind of more non-traditional ways of being. And so thinking about things like language fluency, thinking about kind of how even affection and caring and nurturing and kind of what that looks like in different cultures and different environments. And I think that we have kind of come to a place where it's really important for us to be able to ground ourselves in thinking about that, because I think it's very clear from the literature and the work that we've all done that if we want to be able to move the needle and think about closing gaps, that we really need to kind of come from a place where we are drawing upon those gifts and those talents and those skills that children and families are already coming with, and that it's us as systems, us as providers that kind of need to shift our lens to think about not what is it that we need to do to get the children and the family kind of up to whatever our standards of success look like, but rather how do we as systems and we as individuals who are doing the work, what do we need to do to kind of be more responsive to their needs?
Yeah. Thank you, Neena. Renee?
I would love to share and just connect with what my colleague, Dr. McConnico, has shared, because it is so important to challenge our ways of thinking and our perspectives that we often completely take for granted. When you think about it, a lot of the deficits that land squarely on the shoulders of children and families actually are nurtured and fertilized and facilitated by social, structural, and systemic inequities that create vulnerabilities, that make the risk for vulnerabilities to arise. And if anything has been shown to us during this period of time, during our racial reckoning as a country, during this pandemic of COVID-19, is that these existing structural inequities are completely widened under times of crises, and they were existing long before, and they are ways in which something like a pandemic can even serve to widen inequities. And it is important for us to begin to reframe our thinking, to really be able to see that in the face of all of these systemic and social and structural challenges, families are still remaining resilient. Children are still managing to progress and grow and tap into promise and potential. How much greater would that be if we actually focused on the potential, the brilliance, the opportunity, and the abundance of resources and assets that are brought to the table? And so by challenging our thinking about where deficits come from, where challenges arise from, and beginning to turn our focus to structural and systemic and social context factors, that allows all of us to roll up our sleeves to really work towards long-standing change. And at the same time, it allows us to begin to appreciate all of the creative solutions that families have come up with during this time, all of the creative ways in which children have continued to flourish despite overwhelming challenges. Now, I don't want to downplay that there are significant challenges at play. There are significant degrees of mental distress. There are significant traumas that children have disproportionately faced, particularly if they've had structural challenges. I don't want to downplay that all, but we do not do enough to take a look at all of the ways in which resilience is supported by consistent, strong community relationships, enriching social environments, and strong caregiver relationships. And it's really important to see that cultural identity and cultural assets can be huge resilience factors that we often overlook and we often disregard when we label communities as vulnerable or as deficient.
That is so, that is really just powerful to listen to what you and Neena are sharing, because what I hear in what you're sharing is that with COVID, though as tragic as it has been for our entire nation and abroad, for our families, for our children, that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, really creates an opportunity for us to do something radically different than what we've done in the past. And starting with, because some of the notes that I made as I'm listening is that, you know, this deficit perspective is plaguing children and families, and we've got to stop that. We've got to turn our attention to, Renee, what you're saying, these structural, these societal, systemic challenges that families and children are facing. Lastly, or not lastly, third, we cannot, we can't let COVID be the scapegoat for all of this. We have these inequities, this systemic challenges that you're naming and calling out have been in existence far longer than COVID. And so I'm so glad we're talking about this because, everyone is talking about COVID learning loss and the social isolation and how our kids are going to be, bad off in a sense. And really our system has not been doing its job for a long time, and to your point, has just exacerbated or widened that gap. And so I'm really glad we're talking about this work from a strengths-based lens. I do want to turn it over to Sondra for a second because I think I don't think Sondra and I mentioned at the beginning, we're both speech language pathologists by training with expertise in literacy. And so another reason why our organization really jives with the work of Strive and Vital Village is because we believe that the only way, or we know from research, the only way to really help a child in their literacy journey to becoming proficient, to becoming deep readers, is through relationships. But there's so many commonalities from your areas of study with ours in terms of really this deficit perspective. And so, Sondra, I would love for you to just sort of talk about how this relates to the work that we do with children who have dyslexia or other reading or language disabilities.
Well, I too love listening to Renee and Neena. And to your point, I think you all offer the door that must be opened for educators across the country to be able to get to children, to teach them to read, to enjoy language, to enjoy reading. And without those relationships, and I love the idea of reframing away from trauma specifically, but to the gifts that the children bring. And I know it sounds easy, and I know it's not easy, but the relationships that we try to form with the children that we serve is we want them to be known. We want them to know they are known in their school. We want them to feel safe, to trust that their teacher will never embarrass them or put them into a difficult situation, and that we're going to make that investment in them to look for their gifts and use their gifts to get them to that next place that they need to be educationally. And the other thing I think we have to do is demonstrate the benefit to them. What is it that you get out of being a reader and a learner? And but by appreciating them, by appreciating their voices and giving them a voice in their school, they may not always have the opportunity for their voices to be heard outside of their school because they're young. And it's hard today for our society to put a lot of effort into listening to those young voices. But the school must do that. Every child should know every day that we are here for them and that we are better when they're with us every day. That when they're not here, we suffer as a school and as a community. And so if they can just leave some of the trauma behind and walk into a place every morning where they know that their teachers know them. And one of the things that we never do here is we don't shush children. We don't tell them to be quiet. We ask when we need them to listen, but we count on them to have the ability to do that and to make the decision that when they ask me to listen, if I listen, there'll be something for me to gain from that. So I love how this is evolving here, so that because we already knew that our practices were aligned because we adhere to anything and everything you say, but we also know how to teach children. We know how to teach children to read, and that relationship here at school is really sacrosanct. It is so critical to a child's life and learning. And we're going to build those deep reading brains through that door that you help us open.
Absolutely. I'm going to switch us to the next slide. And, this is not actually my job. We've got someone monitoring the Q&A, but I see a really important question from someone in the chat. And I think it's important that we tackle it now because I want to be sure that we're making the right connections here. So someone wrote that I think what they're asking or posing is that what is the relationship really between cultural identity and what we're talking about? So we're talking about trauma-informed practices. We're talking about relationships, a strength-based approach. And now I've flipped us to resilience in its many forms. Neena or Renee, I'd love for you to just speak directly to the relationship between culture, identity, and everything that we're talking about here around trauma-informed practices and resilience.
Mm-hmm. I can start, Neena, if that's okay. I think often when we talk about trauma, we don't talk about race-based trauma, and we don't talk about trauma associated with racism. But we have so much evidence that speaks to the impact of racism as severely distressing and potentially traumatic in the lives of children. Witnessing a racially motivated encounter that involves your parents can be incredibly frightening and triggering for children. Witnessing incidents of race-based violence on television, online, through videos, hearing about those incidents have an impact of collective trauma. So we know in our history as a country, there was a point in time in this country where lynchings were social events that were meant to engender fear and violence and social control, and were very traumatizing to collective members of the community. And so we know that as a part of our history, and we have a lot of evidence of the way in which it impacts children. So the first thing I want to begin with is making sure as we're thinking about trauma, we are also thinking about ways in which your risk for exposure to trauma may vary depending on aspects of your identity, race, gender, sexuality, immigration status, language that is spoken in your home. We have a variety of ways in which we've seen this unfold, and it has significant implications for children. The second piece is that when we think about resilience and what builds resilience for children, a lot of those factors that build resilience are not from something that individual generates within themselves, but actually come through relational experiences that are reinforced by the social context. So having routines, having reliable relationships, just as Sondra was just talking about, a place where you can go, where you feel safe, and you know that you can count on caregivers. All of those factors actually help build and expand resilience, research has shown. Another factor we often don't talk about that supports resilience is if you live in a racially conscious society, being able to formulate a positive racial identity where you can see a range of cultural assets, riches, and treasures that are associated with that racial identity can be very important to your ability to feel resilient, your ability to regulate your emotions, to experience and engage in society, and ultimately tap into so many of the developmental processes we try to support through learning environments. But that emotional well-being involves all aspects of your identity, including your racial identity, if you reside in a society where race matters.
And I think I agree with all of that Renee has just said. And I think a few things that I would add, or at least highlight, is around that messaging piece and the messages that one is getting about their racial group, about their cultural group from either individuals that look like them or individuals who don't, but also some of that socio-cultural context as well. And so if you are constantly seeing negative imaging and negative messaging about your particular group, and so I say, just as an example for young boys of color, right? If what you see on TV is negative rhetoric, or there's an inherent value judgment that sometimes is underneath that about your self-worth, and you are seeing an image of yourself. And so as a child, how do you rectify that, right? How do you process that? How do you come to understand that? And that for many kids, those negative messages start to become internalized. And so this connection with kind of cultural identity, racial identity, race-based violence and trauma is directly connected and correlated with one's self-esteem, one's self of agency, kind of how your sense of efficacy and kind of the value that you are putting on yourself, but also what values society is placing on you. And what we know from the research on resilience, right? And so several different factors that go into that, but one of them being, right, sense of agency, positive self-esteem, being able to problem solve, as Dr. Boynton-Jarrett talked about, that emotional kind of self-regulation piece. And so they are all interconnected. And as much as we may not want to talk about these things or think about them as interconnected, I do not see a way for us to separate them. If we're going to talk about trauma, if we're going to talk about resilience, if we're going to talk about inequities, learning gaps, then you have to talk about these other pieces around kind of thinking about racism and oppression.
And Ryan, if I could sort of draw a line after
Yes, please.
Renee and Neena, to the deep reading brain and how critical it is that we find a way in to our children to be able to teach them to read, and that our teachers know exactly what they need to do that. Because when you have an opportunity to read books that reflect your race, who you are, and what your family might be like, and you see in your books, and it's different than television, and research tells us that brain works differently off of what it's reading than it does what it sees on television. You get to create your own images when you're reading. And if you think about a child who's learning to read and has an opportunity to see all races and all society in their books, those characters give us an opportunity to think about whether they're making a good decision or a bad decision, whether they need to do something that is helpful to help someone. I know when I read, I think about, oh gosh, what should this character do next? What would be the best thing and the worst thing that character could do, so that our children in their development of their social brain have this opportunity to sort of role play before they get in those situations themselves. But again, you go back, you can't create that if we don't have the door in, because we've learned about them and know what their trauma has been, and we know how to help that particular child feel known, and that we know how to teach them how to read so we can get to that deep reading brain.
Sondra, I'm so glad you jumped in with that, because that was a question that I think one of our listeners, Suzanne, put in the chat around, and she noted that so much of what Renee and Neena touched on, we can shape and we can affirm identity. We can affirm and support differences through literature. And right. I love that you jumped in on that point. So thank you, Suzanne, for sharing that.
And if I may just add something else to that, Ryan, just around the empathy piece. And so I think this conversation that we're having right now, it's not just something that is, we want to focus on kind of non-dominant culture, or folks who identify as something other than white, but that it is this conversation and thinking about tolerance and being able to accept and acknowledge difference, that is also directly related to how we are building and developing empathy. So I wanted to just bring that piece into the conversation too, and this link with the reading and education and learning.
And Neena, I'm going to jump in again, because you mentioned that piece, and we define the deep reading brain as a child who learns through our guidance, personal reflection, P, imagination, I, empathy, E, critical thinking, C, and executive functioning, E. So you really gave me the cue to come in with this piece of understanding the deep reading brain and how comprehension is not enough. We must take our children deeper, and it is all children, because our society depends on our having empathy for others, for critically thinking about what we're hearing and seeing, so that we're not going to be sold a bill of goods, and that we can imagine what others have been through, and that all of these things are a part of our own ability to think from an executive functioning perspective. And that is deep reading. And that is what every single child and every adult needs for our society to be as successful as it can be.
Well, I just switched since y'all are hijacking the presentation. No, it's all good because I just switched to this slide because
it was Neena's fault.
No, I know. No, but it was such a nice segue into this topic, relationships as the gateway to uncovering strengths and the foundation for all learning. And so, I think about the work that we do here at the Atlanta Speech School with our children in the building through our Ward Law School, through our HAM Center that serves children with hearing loss, through Stepping Stones that serves children with speech and language delays, that we must build upon the strengths that children come through our doors with. And so in a world where our standardized and norm reference tests are laser focused, or the sole purpose is to identify what kids cannot do, it is upon us to find out what kids are really strong at, because we've got to use those strengths as a starting point for building skill. And we're not in a place anymore as a country where we can avoid difference, and difference does mean strengths. We're talking about kids who at the speech school come with varying levels of ability, but in terms of their intellect or their creativity and a host of other strengths, we've got to harness those to build skill. And I know the same is true, Renee and Neena, for the work that you all do. And so I went ahead and transitioned to this slide because it happened so naturally. But I do think we should talk more specifically about what we mean when we're saying relationships as the gateway to uncovering those strengths. So anyone jump in.
Well, I'll start. How about that? I expect others to jump in after. One of the things that I think there has been a misunderstanding, Imani said that I indicated that a child could just put their trauma away somewhere and then they could go on and learn. I don't believe that at all. I believe that we have to know their trauma as best we can. We have to ask them to guide us so that we can understand their strengths, their gifts, and their trauma. And everything that Renee and Neena talk about are ways for helping us as educators understand that trauma and help the child move not away from their trauma, but move with their trauma if necessary, so that they can be learners. And so I'll leave then the rest of that to Renee and Neena. But I just wanted to clarify that point.
I think when we think about the foundation of relationships, there's so much we need to understand about ways in which trauma can undermine and unravel the fabric of relationships. And part of the healing process is really rebuilding. So one of the things that can happen with a trauma is it can really disrupt a sense of trust, and it can disrupt a sense of safety, and it can disrupt a sense of agency. And so it is in relationship that those things are reconstructed and redeveloped in the lives of children. So therapeutics are really important. Medications can be important. There are a variety of things we can do, but we really do need to humbly recognize the importance of relationships for the healing process, to reestablish a sense of safety Are people trustworthy? Are they going to be reliable? Will I be harmed again in this situation? That is learned through experiential relationships. So we cannot undermine the importance of relationship with caring, supportive, consistent adults. So time and investing time in relationships is incredibly powerful for children. And us as a society really appreciating and elevating the value and the role that educators play, early childhood educators, teachers, supportive members and neighbors to a family, as well as parents and caregivers. So really investing in their mental well-being as well, having compassion and care for their needs as well is a really important pathway to supporting healing and resilience in the lives of children. So relationships, it's kind of like ripples on a pond. We can't only think about relationships between children and adults. We also have to think about relationships among adults and relationships between individuals and their society, as Neena said. So really holding the humanity and dignity of each person truly matters if we want to have relationships that can promote healing and flourishing and thriving. Another piece I would say is that, there are, the COVID-19 pandemic is existing, and there have been ways of adapting to it and coping to a very difficult and often very stressful and occasionally overwhelming situation. And one of the things that we really want to broaden our mind to are the range of strategies that matter for coping. And this again gets into us having some care about culturally different coping strategies. So for a child or a family where spirituality or a form of religion really is important and central, we cannot kind of ignore that as a part of a way in which coping may be taking place and coping may flourish. And so this for a family where a cultural identity really focuses on a community or community shared sense of responsibility for each other, that's not something we can put to the side and ask the child to just focus on themselves and not worry about something else. So it is also a part of just really our ability to embrace different ways that coping may be best accessed for children as well when we think about an adversity that's ongoing.
So we had someone put in the chat that, just as a comment, that asking teachers to first build relationships with students is a new mental model, as the participant noted. And so we agree with you, and we're there with you, which is why we're so excited to be on talking about this today, because we hope that this COVID-19 pandemic, the racial reckoning that has happened over the last couple of years, as Renee described it, is an opportunity to do something radically different for our students. We know that we're back in school now. School is underway already. And I remember listening to webinars and even in our own organization having conversations about, okay, our kids are coming back. We got to start the testing. Where are they with phonemic awareness? Where are they with phonics? Where are they with vocabulary? And all of those things are critically important because we know that beyond a certain grade, children who are not able to access written text may struggle socially and emotionally because of that. However,
which is another trauma.
Right. But we cannot lead with that. We've got to start with relationships. And so, I think about my husband's an educator, and I just think about my favorite educators when I was young, the people that I learned the most from, because they took time to build relationship with me. And so we agree with you, Suzanne. We know that this is a new mental model. This is a paradigm shift that we really want to incite, because we're with you and we know how important this all is. I'm gonna get us to the last slide here, because I know we want to have more time. There's a lot of questions in the chat, and we want to answer as many of them as we can. But I want to give Sondra an opportunity to, as our Chief Academic Officer here at the Speech School, to talk about what is meant by deep reading, because it's so much more than proficiency. And now, again, with COVID and everything that folks are talking about around COVID learning loss, it seems like everyone's working to get our kids to a place of proficiency. But at the Speech School and the Rollins Center, in our online Cox campus, we want far more than proficiency.
We do. Thanks, Ryan. What I would say is that the deep reading brain actually begins in the last trimester before birth. And from that point forward, as family, as daycare providers, as teachers, we should be on that path of constructing a deep reading brain for each of our children by using deep language, talking with children, expecting responses from them. It's a give and take. You're working in the younger years to help children know that language is valued, and you don't quiet their voices. You listen to their voices so that when they talk with you and share with you, they understand that there is a response that will come from that. And it's a response of value. By the time we get into school, let's say pre-K, you may begin with read alouds, thinking about, and I know several people ask about the acronym, so I'm going to tell you that again, PEACE, and it's really a piece of the puzzle, but getting to a deep reading brain requires first that children learn to decode words, that they're not guessing, they're not learning by sight. They must learn to decode unknown words, because otherwise they will not have access to all of the riches that come from reading. So teaching children phonics and how to decode using those phonics, and then read fluently enough to be able to get to comprehension. That's just stage one of the reading brain. And then when they can comprehend, then you want to take them deeper. You want them to think about the characters in their story, as I mentioned before, and think about how attached they become to those characters. I know children who were reading Harry Potter thought they couldn't wait until the next book came out. And I know that when I read Anne Frank, I thought the world would end. We want to protect the characters we read about. We miss them when we finish the book. We form a relationship with them. Often it's the relationship that we seek from the people around us. So that relationship that we form with the characters in our book, that's who allows us to have this sort of laboratory for ourselves. Would I do that? Oh gosh, he's going to get in trouble. Or should that person have done that? And if the person did something that wasn't quite appropriate or honest or kind, why do you think that happened? What was it in the rest of the story that might have influenced how that character handled this situation? So I'm going to go back over the acronym. PEACE is a piece of the deep reading brain. Personal reflection, thinking about how I handle those situations and how might I have handled this differently than the character in my book. Imagination. Sometimes I might have to put myself in that position as that character and thinking about how I have had experiences that would have been different from my character, so I might have done something differently. Empathy for the people we read about that translates to the people we learn about and know. Empathy is, and I think, Neena, you said that earlier, it is critical in our communities that we understand people come from different perspectives because their lives are different. Critical thinking is a part of this because if you don't have this deep reading brain, you are at risk for listening to anyone tell you anything. And all of these things, all rolled up into our executive functioning, allow us to make decisions about our own lives. And one of the things that we do expect all of our children here in all of our schools to do is make those decisions. So, for instance, if we're about to walk down the hall and other classes are in session, we don't tell our children to be quiet as we go down the hall. We don't tell them not to run. We ask them. There are people in the learning zones around us as we go down the hall. What can we do to show respect for their work? That's an executive function. And that teaches our children a couple of things. One is they can make those decisions. And two is that we trust them to do it.
Sondra, thank you. Thank you. I want to jump in just a little bit here. I want to add to, Sondra, what you're saying, but then I want to take us to a couple of questions, and then folks are asking. I'm getting questions too on the side over here about how folks who are listening can take what we're sharing and make it actionable. But before we get there, I just want to add, Sondra, to your point that, you know, we endorse Dr. Marianne Wolf's and Gholdy Muhammad's definitions of deep reading and deep literacy. And everything that Sondra is saying, Gholdy Muhammad talks about deep literacy or reading and writing as transformative acts of self and society. So not literacy for the sake of literacy, but literacy for the sake of transforming our communities. All going back to what Renee and Neena talked about earlier in breaking down structural and societal barriers. We need deep readers. We need people who are deeply literate to transform our society and maintain our democracy. And so it is really so critical that we have a higher standard for our children beyond proficiency, because we've been shooting for proficiency for a long time, and we're calling for deep literacy and deep reading as a piece of our talk today. I do want to get to a specific question, and this one is for Renee and Neena. Neena, you mentioned at the beginning just, you know, the deficit language associated with trauma-informed. A participant wants to know, what do you suggest in the place of trauma-informed practices?
Great question. Glad you asked, because I have been thinking a lot about this and kind of trying to conceptualize what would be the alternative and kind of how should we think about this. And kind of the best term that I have right now is transformative, resilient, and diversity informed, either practices or systems, because
Can you say it one more time, Neena?
Yep. Transformative, resilient, and diversity-informed systems. If we want to kind of think about it from that systemic place. And I think it really kind of going back to something that you just said, Ryan, around transforming, right? And kind of this idea and this notion and concepts that we've been talking about today, it is a shift, and it is a reframing, but with that goal of transforming, because our systems and the strategies and the approaches that we have been taking for so long, they're not working. They haven't been working for a really, really long time. And as we had said earlier, I think COVID-19 pandemic just kind of shined a spotlight on that. But if we really want to see a difference, then we need to be thinking about it in terms of those transactional pieces. And I have the resilient part in there, just kind of focusing on the strengths and those unique gifts, those talents, thinking about some of those, the cultural pieces that Renee was talking about, and then the diversity informed to really kind of get at this idea of difference, and that is okay, right? And difference in and of itself, like that is a strength, and something that we need to be thinking about in our society.
Thank you, Neena. Renee, I want to give you ask you a question too, because this one has just come through. What are some suggestions that and so let me flip over to our last slide here. What are some suggestions, Renee, that you may have for how to educate staff on learning? And I think this is staff educators, how to educate educators on this approach to learning and behavior compared to a more traditional or punitive approach?
I love this question, and I'm really appreciative for it. I think, this conversation is just so expansive for me, because in order to appreciate that a child has a deep reading brain, you have to have a deep appreciation for the full humanity of the child. The fact that the child may be able to accomplish and think about and do things beyond what we can imagine them to do. We often are in a society where adults are here and children are here, and we don't often think about equity in our relationships with children. We think about supervision, we think about instruction, and we don't think about learning as bidirectional. So this is an opportunity for adults to see themselves as developing alongside children, not only the child developing, not only the child learning, but how do we learn collectively and from each other, including from children. And I think one of the things that we have come to understand is everyone's experiences are uniquely their own. So if you really want to forge a relationship with a child, you have to be willing to learn and understand their experiences from their perspective, not the label that we might impose upon it. And so I think this question very much connects to what we were just talking about around the language of trauma. Sometimes that word can feel restricting, or defining someone solely in relationship to one experience, a set of experiences, or something that has happened, and kind of not seeing the whole person, the whole child, and all of the other things that are a part of their lives. And as a society, we have kind of two pieces of work to do. One piece of work is that we too often have blamed people for things that have happened to them. And part of us having a trauma-informed lens is taking that blame away from the individual and actually correcting something, correcting the responsibility that actually rests on outside of that individual. So there's a power in talking about trauma, because we lived in a society where we couldn't talk about it for a long time or acknowledge it. At the same point in time, we don't want to reduce. And so in order to not do that, we really have to be willing to learn from children, to believe them, to see the world through their eyes also, and to follow their lead. Who knows how a child should best learn? Do we know? Or might the child have some guidance for us about whether they want to sit outside, or whether they want to, stand up, or whether they want to orate, or whether they want, so all of those factors. And I know we're close on time, but I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the bravery of being willing to think in a radically different way about what it means to create a safe environment for learning for children when we all don't feel fully safe. We all don't feel fully comfortable in the context of the world we're living with, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So that is also a way in which we are learning alongside children how to adapt to a more constant uncertainty. And these are things we can't hide or pretend don't exist so that we can supervise and instruct and direct children. So we do really have to reset.
I want to ask two more questions, because we were told that we could go 5 to 8 minutes over. So let's take advantage. Sondra, I'm gonna kick this question to you about early childhood educators. How can we help our early childhood educators talk from a more strengths-based place when they're speaking about young children and let's say their kindergarten readiness or their readiness when they enter school? How can we help shift that conversation to come from a place of strengths as opposed to a place of deficit?
Again, it goes right back to knowing the child, not only from a trauma perspective, but knowing what the strengths are for each. I mean, that is the first thing we as educators should think about. What are the strengths? I want to know the weaknesses. I want to know areas of opportunity, I guess is what I would say. I want to know those things in order for me, and Renee just said, don't children have some understanding of what they need? Yes, I believe they do. And I believe if we engage with them in what our thinking is about what's hard for them and what's not as hard for them, I think we can approach this from a very different perspective. For teachers in the early childhood arena, honestly, this is a really bad plug, I guess, but the Cox campus has so many things for teachers really across the board, from soon after birth all the way up through third grade. But that is a good place to go to get ideas and resources, and it is, of course, without charge. So I think
one resource, Sondra, that I think would be really helpful, since you're bringing this up, is our Family and Language Culture Survey. It is a tool that we ask that the early childhood educators take and share and implement in their buildings so that they can learn more about the families that they serve, their culture, and the languages that their families speak. To use that information, that data directly from the families as a starting point to being able to recognize the strengths of the children in front of you.
Absolutely. And I think if you have children who speak another language or multiple languages, one way to make them feel known is to use just one word of their language. Learn put that investment into those children and learn a word here and a word there so that you can communicate not just the words and the meaning behind the words, but that you care about that child. And Ryan, if I could just say one other thing, and this was about dyslexia, and we didn't address this in our conversation, but I've worked with dyslexic children for many, many, many years. And what I would say is that dyslexia is another trauma when you are in a school and you are unrecognized as having dyslexia. So knowing your children as learners is really important, and getting help. If you wait until they fail at 3rd grade, they will always be behind. If you learn the signs of dyslexia early on, even at 4, you as an astute teacher will be able to say, you know what, I'm noticing this child cannot rapidly recall the letter names or the sounds that are associated with these letters. That is an indication that you need to look further. Our children who are dyslexic can learn to read fluently. They can learn to have deep reading brains. It happens every day here on our campus.
Thank you, Sondra. And again, just to expand a little bit of what you're saying, knowing your students, so the students who may present with indicators of dyslexia, students that may present with language difficulties, or other reading difficulties, because there's many different reading profiles that as educators we need to be aware of. And so when we think about our national data, and the data tells us now that, I don't know, I think it's, is it 64%, Sondra, or 65% of our children who are not reading at proficient levels? Mm-hmm. You can think about what that means if we're thinking about it as a trauma, as a form of trauma. That means that we've got many children sitting in our schools across the country that are not able to access written text. And for many of those students, there's solutions. But as educators and as a system, we have to do better at identifying those kids. I'm going to ask Renee and Neena, one more question. And because we're on this slide, I want to say we have included resources in the resource tab, direct links to Strive, Vital Village, the Cox campus, where we hope you will go and play around, get information, because there are tools there like the trauma-informed practices on Cox campus, authored and designed by Drs. McConnico and Boynton-Jarrett, that are there on the Cox campus in a digestible format, about 10 minutes a time investment for you to be able to glean some practices to be able to implement in your classroom tomorrow. This last question, though, very critical, because we said we want to, sort of ignite a paradigm shift. This question is around, how do we create safe spaces in our environments to have these conversations? And I think it's important to take the time to answer it, because only in a safe space can we really, get the radical change that we're after.
It's a big question, Ryan, that I want to give Renee an opportunity. I'm going to try to kind of say something in 30 seconds, because I think we have like 1 or 2 more minutes left. So I think first and foremost, just something that I have been kind of thinking about as we've been having this conversation is it matters how you show up, right? And you have to come with your most genuine, authentic, curious self right from the very beginning. And I would say one of the ways to be able to foster an environment that is conducive for having these kinds of conversations, for having what, may be at times difficult and challenging conversations with families and children, is to tap into one kind of your human side, because we are all here because we have the best intentions. We want to see children develop their most optimal selves. And the other piece that I would say, it's really, really important to engage in reflective practice. And we didn't talk about that today, but that is also something that is part of Strive and the trauma-informed practices videos that are on the Cox campus. But that idea of kind of being able to take a step back and really think about who you are, how you're showing up in relationship with the children that you are working with, how you're showing up in relationship with their families, what kind of preconceived notions, what kind of values, like kind of what is driving your thoughts and your interactions, and being able to say when you don't know something, right? Or being able to say, or to acknowledge, I didn't intend for something to land that way, or, it wasn't my intent to make you upset, but being able to own those pieces. And I think when we are able to do that in and of itself is transformative, and it allows people to say, you know what? Like, this person may not be perfect, but I know that they genuinely kind of have my best interest at heart. And I know that I can also kind of bring my genuine, my authentic, my, at times, vulnerable self to them. So I could say a lot more, but I'm gonna stop there.
Neena, thank you so much for tackling that question. And I know we've got a lot more, and I wish we had time for more. Again, we want to thank Ed Week. We want to thank our partners at the campaign, at the National Campaign for Grade Level Reading, all of the folks at Strive and Vital Village, but of course, our dear colleagues, Renee and Neena, to my team at the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy and our free online Cox campus. Thank y'all. And Sondra Mims, as always, our Chief Academics Officer, for participating in this. We are so grateful to y'all, and we will try to answer some questions in writing and post them in the resource tab. Thank you so much for joining.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.